The kids were still wearing their sweaters in March. That was the first thing a person noticed, riding up the creek track toward the benchland on a bright, cold morning. 47 small goats moving through clean straw inside an open barn, each one dressed in a knitted wool coat, the color of cream or rust or dove gray, and one, unmistakably, in a deep and serious indigo blue. They bounded and butted and collapsed into piles of each other, the way young goats do when the world has been entirely good to them. Every single one alive, every one healthy. 47 kids from 47 births, and not a loss among them. The valley had not seen winter survival numbers like that. Not this winter, not after January. She and he stood at the fence rail together in the thin March light, shoulders almost touching, watching the herd the way people watch something they built with their own hands and were not entirely sure would hold. There was no ceremony in the way they stood. No particular pride being performed for anyone. Just two people in their early 30s, worn at the edges the way a good tool gets worn, smooth where the grip has been, solid at the core. 7 years of marriage had arranged them into a particular comfortable closeness, the kind where silence between two people carries its own full meaning. He had a carpenter's hands, broad and deliberate, resting on the top rail. She had her arms folded against the cold, her chin tilted slightly upward toward the pen, counting without appearing to count. 47. Still 47. Around them, the homestead sat quietly in the last of winter. The creek below the bench was running again, thin and iron-cold, working its way out from under the ice along the banks. The hand-dug well had a fresh dusting of snow around its cover. The smokehouse stood dark and small behind the cabin. The garden rows were invisible under a crust of white, but they were there. She knew exactly where each one ran. Come April, they would be there waiting, the way good things wait. 4 miles down the valley track lay the nearest settlement. Beyond that, spread across the basin and up into the draws, were the farms and ranches of at least 6 families who had, at various points between October and December of the year before, ridden up this same track specifically to laugh at the goats. The goats in the little wool coats, the ridiculous sight in the ridiculous barn. Those families were not laughing now. 3 of them had taken losses in January that still hadn't been fully tallied. One had lost every kid on the place. They were quiet about it, in the way that frontier people go quiet, when the land wins around and there is nothing left to argue. But something was shifting. She had felt it in the settlement last week, in the way certain eyes had followed her. The laughter was gone. Something else was coming in behind it, something that felt, cautiously, like a question. That question had been 4 years in the making. Longer, if you counted the years before they ever set foot in Wyoming territory. Go back to autumn of 1883. Go back to the creek bench. He found it first. A shelf of land above the Powder River drainage, maybe 40 acres of it, level enough to build on and watered by a spring-fed creek that ran clean even in August. He walked it twice before he believed it was real. The grass came to his knee. The soil, when he cut into it with his boot heel, was dark and held its shape. He rode back to where she was waiting with the wagon and said 3 words. I found it. She had grown up on a sheep farm in western Pennsylvania, the kind of upbringing that teaches a person to read land the way some read books, by moving through it slowly, touching things, naming what she found. When they reached the bench that afternoon, she didn't speak for a long time. She walked the creek margin. She knelt and turned over stones. She pulled a stem of grass and held it between her teeth, and chewed, which was something her father had done, and his father before him. Then she said, There's clay in that cut bank. We can use that. It was as close to rapture as her nature allowed. He had been a carpenter before the territory called him West. A real one, trained to it, the kind who understood load and joint and grain. He could look at standing timber and see the beam inside it. while she catalogued every useful plant on their 40 acres that first autumn, noting in a small cloth-covered book which grasses held the soil, which wild herbs grew near the creek, which slope would catch the morning sun for a garden. He was already choosing which trees to fall and where to set the corner posts. The barn went up first. He insisted on that, and she agreed without argument. You shelter the animals before you shelter yourself. That was frontier logic, and they both understood it. He built it timber and sod, the walls thick enough to hold heat, the roof pitched steep for the snow load that Wyoming winters would bring. Post by post, beam by beam, that autumn of 1883, while the cottonwoods went gold along the creek and the first hard frosts salted the grass each morning. She worked beside him when 2 pairs of hands were needed, and alone when one would do. She was not a woman who stood and watched. She mixed the daubing, she notched the smaller poles, she hauled water from the creek for the mortar, and between tasks she kept adding to her little book. They were stubborn, incompatible ways. He would not begin a task he hadn't thought through. She would not leave a task unfinished. Between those two tendencies, a great deal got done. The cabin came up before the first true blizzard found them, but only just. 4 years of that kind of work will teach you what a place costs. By October 1887, they knew every fault line in their homestead, which corner of the barn lost heat first, which stretch of fence the wind found most easily, which water trough would ice over before any other. They had learned the Powder River Basin the way you learn a difficult neighbor, slowly, respectfully, and without ever quite dropping your guard. The nannies had been generous that autumn, 47 kids, born across 6 weeks, a count that should have felt like triumph. And it did, for about a day and a half. Then she sat down with her little book and wrote the number that mattered more, 11. That was how many kids they had lost the previous winter. Not to predators, not to illness, to cold, to the simple, indifferent arithmetic of temperature dropping faster than small bodies could answer it. She brought it up on a Tuesday evening, the oil lamp throwing its narrow circle across the table between them. She didn't frame it as a proposal exactly. She stated the problem first. 11 dead, 47 now needing to survive, the nights already sharpening. And then she laid out the solution the same way she laid out everything, plainly and without apology. Small fitted wool jackets, 1 for each kid, knitted from their own fiber, shaped to the body, secured so the animal couldn't kick free. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of doubt, the quiet of a man whose mind had already moved past the question of whether, and was working on the question of how. He picked up a pencil. The problem, as he saw it, was the fitting. A kid that age is all legs and indignation. It would not stand still for measuring, let alone for the careful test of a half-finished garment. He needed a form, something low to the ground, gentle on the animal, that would hold it steady just long enough for her to check the fit and mark what needed adjusting. He sketched while she talked. A narrow wooden cradle, padded with burlap, with a simple yoke at the neck. Nothing that would alarm the animal, nothing that would restrict breathing. The sketch took maybe 10 minutes. He studied it, turned the paper around, studied it again. "That'll work," she said, reading it upside down across the table. "It'll need a second crosspiece," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Here." She pointed without touching the paper, and he added the line. This was how they solved things, not by dividing the labor neatly into his work and her work, but by thinking together until the problem had nowhere left to hide. She would knit. He would build the form and help with fittings. 47 sweaters, at roughly 2 evenings apiece, meant the next 2 months would be spoken for entirely. She opened to a fresh page in her little book and wrote the number at the top, 47. Then she picked up her needles and cast on the first stitch. The spinning wheel started before daylight. She had learned the motion young. Her hands knew it, the way lungs know breathing. and by the time the cabin filled with pale October light, she had already worked through the first of the fiber she had set aside the night before. The blend was her own invention, part sheep's wool for warmth, part the coarser goat fiber for durability, the two twisted together into something that had more body than either alone. The lanolin smell of it rose around her like something living. She spun by feel as much as by sight, her fingers reading the thickness of the draft, the way a reader reads a line, quickly, automatically, trusting what the hands knew. He was outside by then, already at the sawbuck with a length of pine scrap across it. The fitting form needed to be right, not simply functional, right. A kid was a nervous creature, fast to panic and slow to forgive, and if the cradle frightened the animal, or pressed wrong against the ribs, the whole operation would become a twice-daily battle neither of them needed. He cut the pieces carefully, beveled the corners, wrapped the yoke in a doubled fold of burlap he tacked down with small nails. He tested the crosspiece for flex, found it wanting, cut a replacement from a heavier board. By mid-morning, the form sat on the barn floor, looking small and strange, and exactly like the sketch, down to the second crosspiece she had pointed to without touching the paper. That evening they sat at the table together, the oil lamp pulled close, the yarn wound into a ball between them. She had cast on for the first sweater the night before. Now she worked in earnest, the needles moving in that small, unhurried rhythm. Click, pull, pass, click, pull, pass. That sounded to him like a clock that kept its own kind of time. He watched for a while, then picked up a second set of needles and the partial practice piece she had set him to working on. His stitches were uneven, and she did not mention it. There would be time. The smell of the barn drifted in through the gap under the door, straw and milk and the faint lanolin tang that matched what rose from the yarn in her hands. Outside, the wind moved through the grass without any particular coldness in it yet. There were still weeks before the first real freeze. 3 evenings later, the first sweater was finished. Cream-colored, slightly lopsided on the left shoulder where she had misjudged the decrease, small enough to cup in both hands. She looked at it a long moment. He carried the smallest kid in from the barn, a pale gray doeling who weighed almost nothing, and set her gently into the fitting form. The animal trembled once, then stilled. She eased the sweater over the small head, worked the legs through, smoothed it flat along the spine. It fit. It did not take long. The first rider came 3 days after the fitting, a wheat farmer from the north end of the valley, who had heard the story second or third hand and did not quite believe it. He tied his horse at the post and asked, politely enough, whether it was true. She told him it was, and offered to show him. He followed her to the barn with the careful expression of a man who has decided in advance to be amused. He was not disappointed. 47 kids moved through the straw in their fitted wool coats, creams and rusts and soft grays, and one unmistakable figure at the back of the pen wearing indigo blue, the color standing out like a bruised thumb against the pale bedding. The wheat farmer looked at them for a long moment, then put one hand over his mouth, then gave it up entirely, and laughed until he had to brace himself against the post. He came out from where he had been patching a roof seam and stood in the barn doorway with his hat in his hand, watching the farmer laugh. He was not a man who embarrassed easily. He let it go its full length. "Well," the farmer said finally, wiping his eyes, "I have seen a great many things in this territory. That is something new." He was gone before noon. By evening, his wife had told the story at the settlement, and the settlement had improved it considerably in the retelling. By the following Saturday, the general storekeeper 4 miles down the road was telling customers about the homesteaders who had decided their goats needed winter wardrobes, and people were laughing before he reached the end of the telling. They came steadily after that. Some rode, some came by wagon. A few walked the 4 miles from the settlement on dry afternoons, just to stand at the fence and look. She let them. He let them. There was no harm in it, and the goats were indifferent to the attention, which somehow made the whole thing funnier to everyone who saw it. The Indigo Kid, who had grown faster than the others and now strutted through the pen with a particular confidence, drew the most comment. Someone gave her a nickname that spread through the valley without any help from her owners. They did not use it themselves, but they heard it enough times that it stopped requiring explanation. She began to notice a pattern in the visitors. The laughter was always genuine, she gave them that. But after it passed, some of them stood at the fence a little longer than laughter required. They watched the way the kids moved in their fitted coats, watched how dry they stayed when they pressed together at the water trough, watched the older nannies nosing at the wool with what looked almost like approval. A few of the visitors asked questions. Not many, but a few. She answered every one of them straight, without apology, and kept her knitting needles moving. The questions did not slow her hands. Nothing did, by that point. She had been knitting long enough that the needles moved the way breathing moved, without instruction, without thought, and the yarn found its own path through her fingers, while her eyes stayed on whoever stood at the fence, asking about fiber content or stitch gauge, or how she kept the neck from pulling too tight on a kid that would not hold still. She answered them. She kept knitting. There were still 20 sweaters left to make. November was not a patient month in the Powder River Basin. It did not ease you toward winter. It simply arrived one morning with shorter light and harder ground, and a wind off the north ridge that had no warmth left in it at all, and you either had what you needed or you were already behind. She knew this. He knew this. They did not discuss it the way people discuss a problem. They simply worked. He spent 3 days reinforcing the inner pen. The straw bales he had stacked in September had settled and compressed, and he restacked them now, tighter, fitting each bale against its neighbor, the way a careful man fits stones in a wall. Then he went outside with a spade and banked sod along the exterior base of the barn's north face, cut squares of frozen-edged earth, layered up to knee height, tamped solid. It would not stop cold. Nothing stopped cold entirely, but it would slow it, and slowing it was what mattered when the temperature dropped faster than an animal could adjust. She watched him from the barn door one evening, a half-finished sweater in her hands, and thought that this was what 7 years looked like when it was working. Not a conversation, not a plan drawn out on paper, just two people who understood what needed doing and did it, each in their own lane, confident the other lane was covered. The sweaters came faster now. Her hands had memorized the shape, the short body, the 4 leg holes that required the most careful planning, the neck ribbing that had to give without gapping. The first ones had taken her 2 full evenings. By the 4th week she was finishing one in a single sitting after supper, the oil lamp throwing its yellow circle across the table, the yarn running through her fingers like water that knew which way to go. 20 became 15, 15 became 8, 8 became 3. On the 1st of December, she reached into the basket for the last skein. Indigo blue, deep as a winter sky an hour before dark. She had been saving it, without deciding to save it. The way you sometimes save the best thing, without admitting that is what you are doing. The smallest doeling was still the smallest, fine-boned and quick-eyed, the last of the 47 to arrive, and the one who still needed the most from whatever warmth the barn could offer. She knitted through the evening. He sat across from her and said very little. By the time she cast off the last stitch, December had fully come. December passed quietly. The sweaters hung on their hooks each morning, while the goats were fed, and were fitted back on each evening before the temperature dropped. The routine settled into the homestead the way good habits do, not noticed anymore, just done. The indigo dueling wore her blue coat and moved through the pen like a small piece of sky that had fallen and decided to stay. January came cold, but not yet cruel. The basin held a thin snow from before Christmas, hard-crusted and gray at the edges, and the creek ran slow beneath a skin of ice that hard. He checked each morning with the heel of his boot. The goats were restless in the way animals are when they know something a person does not yet know. On the morning of the 12th, the air was wrong. Not cold, that was the thing. The 12th came in mild, almost soft, the kind of January morning that makes you trust it. The sky was a pale, featureless white. No wind. She stood in the barn doorway after the morning feeding and said, "It felt like February trying to pretend it was March." And hey, he said nothing because he was looking north, and the horizon had a color he did not have a word for. By midday, the color had a name. The wall came down from the north the way a door slams, not a gradual cooling but a single, brutal change, as though someone had simply switched one world for another. The temperature dropped while they were still standing outside. They felt it happen. The wind came next, driving snow sideways across the benchland, and within the time it took to run from the well to the barn door, the visibility had gone from a mile to the length of an arm. He got the barn doors shut, and she was already inside, pulling the latch rope through. He called for the hammer, and she had it in her hand before he finished the word. He braced the door frame with 2 lengths of timber from the woodpile stacked inside. He had put it inside in October, a decision made without drama, a decision that mattered now. She moved through the barn with an armload of loose straw, pressing fistfuls into every gap she could find along the walls, the low seams where wind could find its way through sod and timber like water finds its way through stone. The goats pressed together in the inner pen. The kids pressed tightest of all, their bright coats, rust, cream, gray, one indigo blue, visible even in the dim light, as the lamp swung on its hook and the wind found the roof and tested it. Outside, the storm said what it meant. Inside, the straw held. The bales held, the walls held seed. He had built in 1884 held. The sweaters held their small heat close to the 47 small bodies that needed it most. He looked at her across the pen. She was already pressing more straw into the north wall. She did not suggest they go back to the house. He did not suggest it either. The decision was made without words, the way most of their important decisions were made, through a shared understanding that some things simply could not be left alone in the dark. He dragged a hay bale from the back wall and set it near the inner pen. She pulled her coat tighter and sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The lamp was turned low to spare the oil. The wind was not low. The wind was everything, a sustained, iron-voiced pressure against the roof, against the walls, against every seam he had packed and chinked and packed again across the years. The timber groaned once, high up near the ridge beam, and then steadied itself, as if it had remembered what it was for. Inside the pen, the kids had arranged themselves the way animals do when cold asks them to cooperate. They pressed flank to flank, the bigger ones along the outside, the smallest tucked deep into the middle of the cluster, 47 small bodies working together as one breathing, shifting, wool-dressed thing. The sweaters, rust and cream and gray, and that one unexpected indigo blue, that skein she had almost set aside, caught and held what the bodies gave off and gave it back. That was all insulation ever did. She had known that since she was a girl on her father's Pennsylvania sheep farm. It did not make heat. It kept what was already there from leaving. She could feel it from the bale, a low, animal warmth pressing outward from the pen, like heat from a banked fire. Not much. Enough. He slept first, his chin dropping after perhaps an hour, his breathing steadying into something slower and deeper than the storm allowed her. She watched the lamp. She watched the kids shift and resettle. One of the nanny goats, the oldest of the 31, the gray one who had never once accepted being told where to stand, pressed herself along the inner bale wall nearest to where they sat, as though she knew the distinction between inside and outside this night was not trivial. She let him sleep as long as she could, and then she touched his shoulder, and he was awake immediately. The way a person is awake when they have not been sleeping deeply, but only resting on top of sleep, like a raft on water. He took the watching. She pulled her coat over her boots and lay across the bale and listened to the storm trying the roof, and listened to 47 small hearts working steadily below that sound, and found, improbably, that she was not frightened. She was tired. She was cold in the way you are cold, when cold has simply become the condition of the world. But underneath that, insulated from it, the way the sweaters insulated the kids from the killing air outside, there was something that held. She was nearly asleep when the wind shifted. The wind shifted on the second night, and by morning of the 14th, the storm had gone quiet in the sudden, absolute way that storms do when they are finished. Not fading, but simply done, the way a held breath is released. He was at the barn door before full light, working his shoulder against the drift that had packed itself there in the dark. She handed tools over the top of the snow, the flat spade first, then the iron bar, and they worked outward in stages, carving a channel toward the yard. The cold was still ferocious, but it was a still cold now, the kind that bites without moving, and that was a different thing entirely from what had pressed against the roof through the night. She counted while he dug. 47.
All standing, some of them interested in the light falling through the opened barn door, ears tipped forward toward the smell of cut snow and cold air. The gray nanny stood apart from the others as she always did, looking unimpressed by the whole affair.
The first neighbor arrived before mid-morning, on foot, because his horse had gone lame in the night. He came across the field from the south with his coat open and his hat pulled low, and his face arranged in a way that she recognized even from a distance as a man carrying hard news. He stopped at the barn threshold and looked at the kids in their rows of color, and he did not laugh. He stood there a long moment. 19 of 22, he said. Born in November and raised fine until last night. He said he was sorry. He meant it. More came through the afternoon. A woman from the East Ridge arrived on horseback and sat in the saddle while she told them, every kid born that season, all 14 of them, gone before dawn. She spoke it plainly, the way people on the frontier speak of loss, without theater, because theater costs energy they did not have to spare. Another family sent word by the neighbor who had come on foot. The pig litter, 8 in all, frozen overnight in a structure that had stood solid for 5 years, and simply was not built for what January 12th asked of it. By the time the light was failing again, the scale of it had come clear. Across the valley, the storm had taken what it chose and left what it chose, and what determined the difference was not luck and not location. It was preparation they had not known to make. She stood in the barn door as the last of the afternoon visitors turned back down the lane. The kids moved behind her in the warm dark. 47, the same number she had counted in October, when the last of the nannies delivered. Not one fewer. She did not know yet what the neighbors would ask. She had slept 4 hours, maybe 5, when the first of them came back. Not to laugh. That was the difference she felt before she could have named it. The way the horses moved down the lane, slower than they had in autumn, no calling ahead, no broad gestures from the saddle. 2 families, on 2 separate mornings within the same week, rode out to the homestead and stopped at the barn fence without being invited inside. She watched them from the doorway. He stood beside her, one shoulder against the frame, hands in his coat pockets. Neither of them spoke first. There was an understanding, unspoken but mutual, that the speaking, when it came, would belong to the visitors. The man from the East Ridge tied his horse and stood at the fence rail. His wife stayed mounted. They both looked into the pen where the kids moved in their slow morning shuffle, jostling toward the hay, the sweaters gone soft with wear now, the rust-colored ones and the creams, and the single indigo blue, all of it faded a shade or two but still whole, still holding. The man counted. She could see him doing it, his eyes moving methodically down the pen, the slight movement of his lips, He reached whatever number he reached. He did not say it aloud. He looked at the barn floor for a long moment, then back at the herd, then at nothing in particular, and she understood that what he was doing was not admiring. It was reckoning. A quiet, private, costly kind of reckoning that asked a man to hold two things at once: what he had lost and what he had failed to imagine was possible. The second family came 2 days later. The woman first, down the lane with her husband behind her. They too stopped at the fence. They too counted. The woman's face was composed in that careful frontier way, held still the way you hold a lamp in wind, because letting it move risks losing the flame entirely. Nobody said anything about the sweaters, not a word. They had stopped being funny sometime around the 3rd hour of January 12th, and they would not be funny again. They were just wool on small animals in a warm barn, and they meant 47 kids alive when nothing else stood between them and the cold. He offered coffee both times. Both times it was accepted, quietly, and they all stood around the table and drank it and talked about the weather and the condition of the roads and what the snow might do in February. They talked about everything except the thing they had come about, because the thing they had come about was not yet a question. It was still becoming one. She refilled the cups and said nothing. Outside, the kids moved in the hay. February came in gray and slow, the way grief sometimes does. Not in a rush, but settling over everything by degrees, until you looked up and realized it had been there for days. The snow on the benchland held firm, crust hard by morning, softening only slightly by afternoon, before freezing again at dusk. The roads between homesteads were rutted channels between white walls, and traveling them meant intention. Nobody rode 4 miles in February without reason. They came anyway. By the 2nd week of the month, 4 families had made the trip. By the 3rd, 6. Each arrival followed the same quiet pattern: the pause at the fence, the counting, the careful faces, and each visit moved through the same unspoken progression until finally, somewhere in the 2nd cup of coffee, the question arrived. Not with embarrassment, not quite. With the particular plainness of people who have stopped caring how something sounds because they care more about learning it. How did you do it? And she would answer without ceremony, the way she had always answered practical questions, because that was what it was. A practical question. She would describe the fiber blend first, the ratio of sheep wool to goat fiber, how the goat fiber added loft, and the sheep wool gave structure, how she had arrived at that ratio by accident 2 seasons ago, and written it in the back of her household book. She would describe the needles, the gauge, the pattern she had developed by trial over 4 evenings in September, adjusting the body width and the leg openings and the neck until the fit held firm without restricting movement. He would bring out the wooden fitting form he had built, low and smooth, and set it on the table so they could see how it worked, how a kid held briefly in the frame could be measured and fitted without distress. They asked about the straw bale pen. He drew the layout on the back of a flour sack with a carpenter's pencil, the placement inside the main barn structure, the depth of the bedding, the way the inner walls held radiant warmth, even when the outer barn dropped toward freezing. And then she went to the shelf and brought down the brown paper. She had written the sweater pattern out 6 times, 1 copy for each family, working at the table in the evenings with the same oil lamp that had lit 47 sweaters into being. The handwriting was clear and measured, each step numbered, the needle size noted at the top, the fiber instructions written in the margin in smaller script. She had folded each sheet and written the family's name on the outside. She handed them out without theater. He refilled the coffee. The only thing they asked in return was this: that each family teach the method to at least 1 more household before the next winter came. Not payment, just continuation. Every family agreed without hesitation. The coffee was still warm when the lesson began. She had arranged the hay bales in a rough circle near the kid pen, close enough that the animals could be watched and touched, close enough that the warmth of 47 small bodies still moved through the air like something earned. The neighbors settled themselves with the careful dignity of people who understood they were students now. Hats came off, hands were folded, then unfolded, then accepted the needles she pressed into them, one pair at a time. He stood near the wooden fitting frame, which he had moved from the corner to the center of the space for the occasion. He did not speak much. He had never been a man who needed to fill silence with words. But when a question came, about the depth of the straw bales, about the angle of the inner wall, about how early a kid needed to be fitted before the cold could reach it, he answered with the same patient economy he brought to every joint he had ever cut. She moved through the circle, like someone who had always known how to teach, without making a person feel small. She touched wrists gently to correct tension. She demonstrated the first cast-on stitch 3 times without impatience. She told them it would feel wrong before it felt right, and that this was how most things worth doing began. A few of the farmers laughed at their own clumsy fingers. She laughed with them, not ahead of them. The kids moved among the boots and the hay bale legs without fear, trailing color, cream, rust, gray, and that one unrepeatable length of indigo blue that had given the whole herd its festive, improbable look all winter long. One of the rancher's wives reached down and stroked a rust-colored kid on the back without thinking. The way you reach for something that has already become ordinary. No one remarked on it. It simply happened. By mid-morning, the circle was working in near silence, the click of needles steady as a small clock, the animals turning in the light that came through the barn door in long, pale bars. He leaned against the fence rail that divided the main floor from the kid pen. After a moment, she came and stood beside him, her shoulder touching his, both of them watching the room. 7 years of mornings, 7 years of evenings by lamplight. A herd of 47, alive in the March cold, dressed in the colors of whatever yarn they'd had. You could not see any of it from the fence rail, not directly. You could only see 2 people standing quietly while their neighbors learned. But it was all there, every stitch of it, in the warmth of that barn, in the hands that were now beginning to understand what patience, held long enough, becomes.